Night gathered over the city like tinted glass, muting the avenues and flattening distant sirens into a long, slow thread. The hospital's entrance threw a white rectangle onto the drive, and an ambulance slid into it without a sound. Lights moving, siren off. The kind of arrival reserved for cases where attention is a resource to be rationed. The doors hissed, the gurney appeared, and two medics walked with the practiced hush of people who have learned that even noise can bruise. The medics, all economy, handed off numbers and snowstorms of printouts, while the elevator seemed to understand on its own that it should be waiting. Upstairs, the ICU was the color of low tide, pale greens, fluorescent blues, the steady pulse of monitor light painting squares onto the glass. The unit had its own weather, and tonight the barometer had dropped. When the billionaire arrived, no last name, just the last initial on a wristband that didn't need explaining, the air in the hall pulled tight, as if the building understood the stakes and adjusted its grip. The room took him the way a bay takes a boat. Not greedily, not gently, just with the inevitability of a place built for this. He came in with a skin tone gone to ash and a mouth parted for an artificial breath, the kind that moves but doesn't travel. Someone had cut his shirt along the seams in a neat autopsy of wealth, collected the halves, and folded them into a single square that sat on a chair like a confession. A circle formed around the bed with the precision of a lock engaging. Intensivist, cardio, neuro, RT. Two nurses who spoke in a language composed of noun fragments and numbers. A pharmacist whose hands hovered near syringes as if they were punctuation. The chief stood where a chief stands, not commanding so much as giving the room a center of gravity. They moved without choreography, but still landed in the right places, like birds that had practiced the migration so often the sky remembered. He had been awake an hour earlier, said the medics, then he wasn't. The smaller hospital, the one known for pleasant delivery rooms and brisk orthopedic repairs, had done what it could and sent him here along a vein of city streets that seemed to agree to be empty for once. A lawyer's voice, distant and careful, issued permissions from a speakerphone that someone muted and unmuted with the same fingertip. Machines attached themselves and began to translate. The monitor gave back a page of heart language in small green waves. The oximeter taught the room a number and then refused to be consistent about it. The ventilator spoke in huffs as regular as stairs. The billionaire lay loose and heavy, stripped to simple nouns. Skin, tube, tape, line. Humanity is a subtraction problem in places like this, and the ICU is very good at knowing what to subtract now and what to leave for later. Diagnostics blossomed. Blood left through ports and returned as results. Images stacked in the cloud and on a monitor that had to be swiveled because it was designed for rooms not as cramped as this one had quickly become. Possibilities were proposed and interrogated with the calm, almost cheerful skepticism of people who know that truth is a shy animal. Heart? It didn't look like the heart was currently writing the worst of the story. Lungs? Certainly not pleased, but the pattern was insufficiently tidy. Through the glass, the corridor pretended to be patient. A volunteer put out a new carafe of coffee that steamed without smelling like anything. A social worker turned an empty chair toward the wall so that it looked less like a chair and more like an absence. Malik rolled his cart along the far wall as if he had always been part of this hallway. His badge didn't confer authority, it conferred motion. It opened closets, not doors. Environmental services, it read, which is the hospital's polite way of saying there's a man who will undo your messes at a speed the eye often fails to register. Night crews learn to measure time in sweeps and passes, in how many waistliners are still tight at the rim, in how far a mop bucket empties with one bay versus another. Malik measured time in sounds. The building made a music that no one had scored. Elevator relays clicking like crickets, ice machines lying about their filters with an occasional sulk, the hush of doors that had decided to misbehave until someone said, please. Oxygen flowed with a sound he could sketch blindfolded, a steady whisper just that side of silence when the flow was right, a fretful quiver when something upstream had learned a bad habit. He did not call himself anything but janitor. That word, plain as bread, fit in his mouth without jamming. If someone said custodial, he smiled and said, sure. If someone said housekeeping, he said, that's my cousin's down on 4. He passed the billionaire's glass twice before the hour folded. The unit was a mirror show, reflections layered over actions, nurses doubled and redoubled by pains so clean they erased themselves. From one angle, Malik saw only edges, a pump display, a corner of sheet, a hand on the rail. He clocked the shapes, the clearances, the paths a rolling thing might need. The way a person who polishes floors for a living learns to read furniture like traffic. Rooms get overhandled on nights like this. Not carelessly, but by the nature of care. A cooling unit squeezed into a corner not shaped for it, making the drape bow the way a sail bows in a trick wind. An extra pump tower angled in because angle was the only geometry that would allow it to share the outlet. A stool nudged under a vent that had begun to speak a little louder than usual. Just enough clutter to argue with elegance. He wasn't looking for anything except the building's mood. He didn't press his face to the glass. He didn't change his path. He listened as if listening were a broom for tangled air. Inside the bay, the voices of the team rose and fell, never sharp, always close to the page. Orders traveled in short lines. Labs in 5. Will bolus. Hold there. Again. He couldn't hear the whole of the conversation, only that ring in professional voices that means the point of the exercise has narrowed to a single bright dot. He kept moving because stillness looked like staring, and staring made him a problem. And the last thing a knight needs is another problem. The billionaire's life, lived in headlines and market graphs, belonged now to the same supplies as anyone's. Tubing, tape, linen, plastic, stainless steel. Malik pivoted around the nurse's station and pulled a clear bag liner free with a practiced snap that made a pure, hollow sound. He retied the knot tighter than necessary, habit or superstition. He caught his own reflection in the stainless side of the cart and looked away, the way a person looks away from a mirror they don't own. On his third pass, the building told him something quiet. Not wrong, quiet. The oxygen hiss had a hitch in it, a half-syllable swallowed mid-word. He didn't stop. He didn't even slow. He let the sound enter the file cabinet in his head, where he kept the remarkable ordinary, a freezer door that liked to think it was closed when it wasn't, a ceiling tile above a printer that dripped only when it rained, a caster that developed opinions. He turned into the family restroom, scrubbed a sink until the mirror threw back clarity, folded a stack of towels the way his grandmother folded church linens, symmetrical and proud, then came back out with the sense that the hallway had leaned a degree. The hiss again, with that slight interruption. Not a stutter so much as a reconsideration. The unit's night song made it easy to miss. He guessed most people would miss it on purpose. The ICU teaches the ear to prioritize, and small mechanical hesitations are the first things to be taught humility. He paused by the little gap where curtain meets glass, the place where a person's gaze could graze the edge of a scene without entering. The team moved with that tired velocity that knows frantic is a waste. Sat's not happy. Heart willing, but not enthusiastic. An arterial line doing needlepoint in an unseen wrist. Someone finished a note, then erased a word and replaced it with one that was the same word except kinder. The billionaire's mouth worked around a tube in a way that makes every mouth look young and every face look temporary. He adjusted the angle of his cart so it paralleled the glass, as if that mattered. He smoothed a cloth he had already smoothed. He listened. Machines don't change their minds. When they change their behavior, something has changed around them. The hiss ran even, then it hiccuped, then even again, like a swimmer breathing every third stroke, noticeable only if you choose to count. 2 bays down, someone laughed at a message on a phone and the laugh skated along the floor like a quarter you flip and try to catch. It arrived at the billionaire's bay and died there without malice. The chief spoke, not to command, to condense. Let's stabilize what we control, which is a sentence that honors both science and limits. The neurologist nodded with the small grace of a person agreeing to postpone appetite. Malik moved on. He didn't want to be the man standing near a room as if proximity conferred importance. He knew how quickly a night could sour when people began to perform their roles instead of doing them. He cleaned a handrail with the devotion of a man polishing the banister of an old house. He topped off a sanitizer dispenser. He caught a rolling trash can with his foot before it kissed a nurse's shin. The unit had a way of rewarding small loyalty with the permission to keep moving. Hours in hospitals expand and contract unpredictably, a rubber band around a handful of minutes. By 2, the unit had thinned. The essential remained. Some rooms had begun to drift toward morning. This one refused to drift anywhere. The numbers performed a cruel ballet near a threshold that mattered just enough to keep everyone counting. The chief's hands migrated from pockets to hips to the bedrail and back, a metronome running out of clock. The oxygen whisper did its small, disappearing act again. He let himself look, not into the room, but low, where the world is all wheels and legs and a forest of lines. From the hallway, you can sometimes see the bottom edge of a bed frame if you step into the right triangle of space near the foot. He stepped there, the way a man might step to the window to check the weather. Through the glass, shadows made a diagram you could misread if you were in a hurry. He didn't read it. He let it be a picture for now. His flashlight was the small kind, meant for pockets and gentle arguments. He carried it because buildings had corners logic forgot. He didn't take it out. He rehearsed taking it out. He considered policy and imagined being told rightly that he should not be pointing beams anywhere near sterile things. He pictured a phrase he'd heard once, anyone can call a safety pause, and wondered whether anyone included the man with a cart. The nurse who had nodded at him earlier surfaced from her chart and met his eyes, offering that corridor grace of mutual acknowledgement. He gestured at his cart, a question without words. "Need anything?" She shook her head and mouthed, "Thanks." He nodded back and let the moment go by the way you let a good parking spot go when you're not actually looking for one. He had learned in 100 lesser moments that rooms ask for help indirectly. A bed that doesn't fit quite right against a wall. A plug that keeps wanting the outlet you've already promised to something else. A line that runs under instead of around because under is faster in the 5-second crisis where everyone was meeting each other for the first time. The marks on the floor told their tiny history. Crescent arcs where casters had pivoted hard. A scuff that meant someone's shoe had tried and failed to stop a rolling tower. A faint wheel ghost near the head wall where something big had been pushed, then pulled back, then pushed again. He circled, slowly enough to be called unhurried and quickly enough to be called not loitering, and let his concern assemble itself into a sentence he could live with. He chose a neutral opening, offer help, don't announce insight, and parked at the nurse's desk with the attitude of a man about to ask for a new bag of liners. When the nurse's eyes rose, he didn't dive straight for the heart of it. He used a doorway sentence that could be answered without anyone feeling accused. "Would it help if I clear the floor space by the head wall?" he asked. "Sometimes during rush we lose caps and bottle rings. I can sweep with the light and not touch anything." The question earned him a polite refusal and, baked into it, a flicker of consideration. Policies are designed for days. Nights are an exceptions, but only when trust has been properly introduced. He backed away with a nod and aligned his cart as if alignment were a virtue. He could wait. He had become expert at waiting without turning into a statue. The hiss hiccuped again. Maybe it had always hiccuped. Maybe he was the only one who had not yet trained himself not to hear it. The nurse came back to the curtain and eased it a fraction. "Quick look," she said softly, which in ICU language is both permission and test. Only eyes. He lowered himself until he felt the floor through his knees and the building through his palms. He did not cross the threshold. He kept his shoulders in the hallway and let the beam paint only the lower geometry. Caster, rail, pump leg, the low swing of a safety bar. Lines draped and crossed with the elegance that improvisation sometimes achieves. The tube he had been listening to tried to draw a straight path from the wall to its obligation. For a short run it did. Then it passed into a shadow too dense for the angle he had. The beam stopped just shy of that density. He widened it, then narrowed it. More to tell his hands he was doing something than out of hope that the light would find a new adjective for the same noun. The hiss held steady, as if to spite his curiosity. He clicked off the light and let his eyes rest in the clarity that follows restraint. From inside, give it a few minutes. From the desk, the printer's chatter, shaking out a fresh ribbon of numbers. From the hallway, nothing, which is its own kind of pressure. Malik didn't say what he thought. He didn't let his face say it either. He put the light away and allowed the idea to grow in the dark, where ideas often grow braver. He rose slow, the way you rise when you want the night to believe you are part of it and not an interruption. He straightened a stack of wipes no one would notice and pivoted his cart just enough to keep it in play. The nurse glanced at him, saw nothing alarming on his face, and returned to the blue of the screen. Beyond the glass, the billionaire lay among the nouns. Numbers tried to mean something and kept almost getting there. The team continued to be the team, steady, unseduced by panic, bored by drama. The building hummed the way it hums when the river is low and the traffic lights are stuck on an all-night cycle. Outside, a light rain began in a theater of street lamps and never quite made it to the ground. The hour that followed was not generous. It gave nothing that could be wrapped in a sentence and called progress. Small adjustments schemed for small gains. A pump's rate changed, and a number rose and then fell and then rose again as if it had remembered a promise. The chief's face arranged itself into the expression all chiefs learn. Attention without grimness, focus without the cruelty of denial. They held a line invisible to anyone not in the circle. Malik kept his patrol. He gathered whatever stray pieces the room wanted to shed. A slip of paper that had captured a shoe print, a popped blue cap that had attempted escape, a glove with its fingers crushed into the posture of a tired hand. He didn't approach the curtain again. He didn't need to. The sound followed him. It had to his ear that quality of a faucet you're certain you tightened. The small, stubborn insistence that no, something is not seated quite right. He did what nightmen do. He made a plan that looked like routine. He would wait for the lull that all busy rooms grant if you stand there long enough. He would ask a different nurse a different question that contained the same offer. He would use the least alarming words available. He would give the room a way to be right even if he turned out to be wrong. He would spend the currency he earned one shiny coin at a time for years. Competence without performance, presence without insistence. Around 3, the ICU went through one of those synchronized breaths hospitals take when the city's insomnia aligns with the nurse's overdue charting. A pair of pagers purred and quieted. A printer coughed and stopped. A door sighed shut down the hall. The nurse he'd first spoken to stepped to the curtain again and gave him a short nod that meant, "Okay, one more try." He did not smile. Knights dislike smiles that mean more than they say. He knelt, but only in the hallway. The curtain left a triangle of truth visible, the corner where the bed met the head wall. The light found the floor, then the wheel, then the mess of necessary legs that hold machines upright. The tube traced its geography with a stubborn, practical beauty. It wanted to be straight. It wanted to be uncomplicated. For a little way it was. Then, under the place where metal met motion, the brightness on its skin changed to a duller stripe. He did not chase the dullness with the light. He let absence do the talking. The hiss ran. The half-second came and went. He clicked the light off and listened to the building say the same thing in 2 different dialects. Almost and not yet. The nurse watched his face for alarm and found only care. "Anything?" she whispered. He lifted one hand, wait a second, and not in a way that suggested he had found a smoking gun. He tracked the sound with his eyes closed because the eyes were overeager and the ears were patient. The hiss evened. He opened his eyes. He stood by not standing. He kept the good end of the suspense in place because you don't steal the reveal from the room that has to live with its consequences. The chief said from inside, "We reassess in 5." The sentence was both a promise and a cliff. Malik stepped back and let the minute take its place. The building hummed. The rain at the windows remembered itself. A guard at the end of the hall shifted weight from left to right and back again. What mattered in those last inches of night was not a heroic gesture or a shouted warning. What mattered was the quiet choice to keep the question alive. Malik smoothed the cloth on the cardigan and did not reach for the light. He had seen enough to know where to look and said nothing yet, because words, like lines, must be clear, and timing, especially on nights like this, must be exact. And so the first part ends where rooms often begin to change. With a breath held, a small sound counted correctly, a man on his knees outside a curtain, and a single detail at the edge of the map, waiting for daylight or courage, whichever arrived. First, the 5 minutes stretched like a drawbridge, half up, half down, while the room rehearsed what it would do if dawn arrived first. The nurse kept the curtain open that careful hand's width, a narrow treaty between sterile air and the hallway. Malik stayed in the corridor with his knees finding the floor again, the small flashlight trapped in his palm so it couldn't look like a tool, only like a thought. The hiss he'd been counting in his head ran true, faltered, then behaved, the way a metronome skips if the table under it has a wobble no one can see. He didn't pitch a theory, he offered a task. "I can sweep the floor line with the light," he said, quiet enough to be a suggestion, not a claim. "Sometimes stuff gets under wheels." "Don't touch anything," she said, which in this place was a promise as much as a warning. She called the respiratory therapist with a glance more than a word. To the room, she said, "Quick pause at the head," and to Malik, "Point only." The therapist arrived with a competence that had learned to be short with time, but never with people. He followed Malik's beam as it skated along rubber and metal and into the dark knot where lines tried to keep out from under the bed's rear caster and failed at geometry. From this angle, it wasn't an accusation. It was a question about physics. The therapist crouched inside the line of the curtain, mirrored to Malik's crouch outside, 2 halves of an unplanned diagram. "Hand me a mirror," the therapist told the nurse, and a small inspection mirror appeared, a thing more at home in a mechanic's pocket than on a medical tray. He angled it into the narrow alley where the caster lived, soaked in shadow, found a reflection, and found, within that reflection, a shape that should have been a smooth curve, but wasn't. Malik kept the light steady, not because the therapist needed it, but because steadiness itself can be contagious. "Hold ventilation," the therapist murmured, and the nurse, already anticipating, switched the source to a portable cylinder trailing like a loyal dog at the bedside. The hiss shifted to the portable's tone, a little higher, a little more insistent. Numbers steadied as if grateful for the substitution. The therapist put two gloved fingers to the bed frame lever and looked for a second pair of hands. "On three," the nurse said, and the bed tilted a sliver, just enough to loosen the physics without telling gravity to go home. The therapist slipped the mirror out, leaned, and freed the line with a movement that was more kindness than force. He held the green tubing in the palm of his hand, stroking it once along the flattening like a man apologizing to a bent reed. The tube lifted, settled, found a new path. The path it had always deserved, but the old injury still marked it, a pale ridge where the caster had kissed too hard. "Replace?" the nurse asked. "Replace," he answered, already reaching for a fresh coil. The swap was a dance that would have bored a camera. Clamp, switch, confirm, unclamp. The new line ran like a straight answer. The hiss found its uninterrupted sentence and kept it. The room didn't cheer. It nodded, a collective muscle unclenching. The monitors responded the way honest instruments do, first with suspicion, then with measurable gratitude. Oxygen saturation crept upward, and then, as if surprised at its own courage, held. A blue chill at the billionaire's lips eased. A bell that had been sulking stopped sulking. The chief, who had not moved for an hour more than 8 inches in any direction, let one hand leave the rail and orbit down to the pocket where the pen lived. "Note," the chief said. "Mechanical obstruction addressed. Reassess." The voice was the same as always, but the air around it had fewer splinters. No one looked at Malik directly. Hospitals have rituals for gratitude, and this wasn't the moment for them. The nurse glanced toward the curtain and gave a nod that contained more than a nod usually can. "Thanks, boundary kept. We saw what you did and what you didn't do." He tucked the light away as if it had embarrassed him by being useful. The room did not transform into triumph. It transformed into work that felt like it mattered again. Orders changed shape, less of the fishing expedition, more of the repair list. The therapist traced every line to the wall ports, as if introducing them to their destiny. The nurse rolled the bed 2 inches off the head wall to route the forest of cables into civilized loops. Someone fetched a small wedge and left it by the caster like a promise that gravity would be negotiated with next time instead of allowed to win by accident. A blood gas went off to the lab. The chief called for a repeat film less for cinema than for the comfort of seeing air go where air should go. The cardiologist updated a medication plan with the controlled relief of a man swapping a broken wrench for one that makes a sound he trusts. They didn't speak in exclamation points. They spoke in the short, true sentences you use when you've been given a margin. In the hallway, the billionaire's security detail materialized and dematerialized like a stage effect, checking faces, checking doors, never checking the fundamentals because fundamentals were handled inside the glass. Malik eased his cart out of the narrow triangle he'd occupied and resumed being the moving part no one tracks. He emptied a small bin, wiped a stainless edge, pushed a stool back under a counter where feet wouldn't find it. The building changed pitch. The ICU has a tone when the pendulum swings toward possibility. It's not louder, it's cleaner. The nurse adjusted sedation, announced it as calmly as she would have announced the weather. A resident fixed eyes on a number as if trying to hold it with gaze alone. The chief allowed a chair to do its job and sat, spine still a line, attention still afield. The blood gas returned with numbers that weren't pretty, but contained less insult. Nobody clapped. The therapist said, "We'll keep ventilatory support here," and tapped a chart with a pencil he'd whittled with his teeth. The neurologist, never quick to be seduced by respiratory optimism, listened to the new quiet and allowed the corner of a mouth to consider a different future. The nurse who'd let Malik help leaned out of the curtain and in the same movement straightened a hand sanitizer pump he'd already straightened. "Thank you," she said, the words disguised as routine. He answered with a nod disguised as routine. That was enough. Knights are skeptical of ceremony. The billionaire did not sit up, apologize to his shareholders, and ask for coffee. He lay where he lay, but the terrible stillness in his face traded itself for a stillness that belonged to resting bodies instead of abandoned ones. Every few minutes, the monitors checked in with their small question, "Still okay?" The numbers replied, not belligerently this time, with the social grace of a guest who has decided to try the soup. Malik moved on because moving on was what the unit needed him to do. 2 corridors away, he righted a cart that had wedged itself into a personality dispute with a doorstop. He replaced a bag in the family lounge. He folded a blanket someone had discarded like a flag after a surrender. He didn't tell anyone a story about himself. He didn't rehearse a version of events where he had saved a billionaire. He let the building keep the narrative, which is where most true stories belong until they're done. Back at the bay, the tempo settled into that strange ICU limbo between crisis and outcome. The team stayed plenty busy, but the haste wore less poison. A nurse's shoulders, which had been creeping toward the ears, unhooked and drifted back toward their proper latitude. The therapist rewrote the tubing so that it would have to think hard before tangling with anything heavier than air. The chief and the night pharmacist negotiated the stepping down of certain drugs as if lowering a fragile object in slow water. "Document the obstruction in the turnover," the chief said, "and the correction. Flag the roading as a risk if we're crowded." Simple words, but they had weight. The nurse wrote them as if the ink had mass. The security detail sent in a man with the dry voice of money who wanted updates without asking questions a doctor would resent. He left with less posture than he brought. In his wake came a woman in a suit that did not expect to see 3 in the morning. She kept 2 phones in one hand and bit the nail of the other. The nurse guided her to the family lounge with that unmatched ICU kindness that makes you do what is best for you against your instincts. For a half hour, the numbers kept their quiet truce with physiology. Then the monitors, which disliked complacency, found a new wobble, a CO2 trace that didn't love its own shape, a heart rate that flirted with a speed it hadn't been invited to, the oxygen number refusing to climb past a ceiling it had invented for itself. The room didn't panic. It recalibrated its hope. The therapist adjusted settings by millimeters. The nurse checked the seating of the mask again in motions that had made her wrists strong. The chief drew a thin line with the pen on a paper no one would read twice and said, "We hold here. Let the lungs relearn with a fair chance." If this were a different story, someone would have entered with a theory so elaborate it needed an index. Here no one was in love with their own brain. They were in love with the part of medicine that sometimes says, "We are going to make this body's work easier and see if it takes the invitation." The hours traded places. 3 went and 4 came in, a pale draft slipping under the doors from a sky considering light. In the hallway, the guard rotated weight from foot to foot and then forgot to again. The building hummed the more optimistic key it reserves for near morning, when bad nights are either over or have decided to become worse in a way you can name. Malik kept being useful. He restocked, rebagged, rebuffed. When he passed the bay again, he saw a new calm in the posture of the equipment. The way a living room looks different after someone has vacuumed, even if the furniture hasn't moved. The new tubing hung in a small ceremonial arc, a tidy sentence with a period at the end. The wedge under the caster sat like a modest guard. The nurse caught his eye and lifted a thumb in a gesture so small it barely counted as motion. He returned the smallest of nods. He wanted to vanish before anyone thought to put him inside a story he wasn't finished living yet. But the night had one more argument left. The billionaire's blood pressure flirted with a drop that made the resident reach for a label he didn't want to deploy. The chief stepped in and turned that motion into a pause. "Check the basics before we escalate," the chief said, almost gently. They ran the ABCs like a ritual they believed in because they did. Airway, breathing, circulation. Each looked better now than the hour before. The drop corrected with fluids, like a sulking child deciding to accept dinner after all. "You see?" the pharmacist said to no one, which is a thing pharmacists sometimes do when drugs aren't driving the bus and they're okay with it. By 5, the labs grew less interesting in the best way. The numbers that tell war stories, lactate, pH, stopped shouting and started reporting. The blue at the lips had long since ceded ground to something you could tell a family about without apologizing first. The neurologist checked reflexes with a seriousness that made even the reflexes straighten up. "Turnover at 6, the chief said. "Make sure the obstruction is at the top." The nurse wrote it bigger this time, in a neat hand that could convince even an indifferent morning that this mattered. Malik, passing with a fresh stack of liners, caught another sliver of scene, the resident gathering the team for a quiet 3-sentence debrief inside the bay. No victory speeches. Just the right accounting, what went wrong, what went right, what will be checked by sight and hand the next time a bed does a little dance in a crowded room. Someone said, "Add crawl check under wheels and rails to the checklist." Someone else said, "All staff may call a safety pause." And the words rode the glass into the hallway like a breeze you only feel if you're paying attention. He let himself stop one last time by the curtain's edge, because endings deserve witnesses even if they're only intermissions. The billionaire breathed with the help he needed and not a drop more. The monitors, bored with drama, sang their 2-note lullaby. The hose made no speeches, just moved air like a river does. Forward, forward. The nurse stepped out with a chart hugged to the chest. For the first time that night, she allowed herself a line that was not purely about the patient. "You've got good ears," she said. "Old building talks," he answered. "I just listen when it gets shy." She smiled in that way night shift people smile when they recognize a colleague who doesn't share their title. "We'll see you on this other side of sunrise." He nodded and turned away, because turning away was the most respectful thing he could do with a good moment. He pushed the cart toward the elevators, past the waiting area where the woman in the suit had fallen asleep sitting upright, past the volunteer refilling the coffee that everyone pretends not to drink. He felt none of the heat of heroism, only the cooling relief of a machine that stops insisting something is off. Behind him, inside the glass, the team kept the vigil that mattered. Ahead of him, down the corridor, the windows began to hint at a color that wasn't artificial. Part 2 doesn't end with trumpets. It ends with a hum rewired into something closer to a heartbeat, and with a room that has wrestled chaos back into a set of manageable nouns. The detail he noticed had done what details are supposed to do: restore fairness, without stealing any of the mystery from the hours that would still have to decide which way this story would go when morning signed in and took attendance. Dawn didn't so much arrive as rinse the color back into the windows. The ICU adjusted its posture the way a city straightens its tie before a meeting. Night shift voices got grainy. Day shift faces checked themselves in reflections. The room with the billionaire stopped being a suspense novel and became a deposition. Facts, timelines, what got fixed, who touched what and when. They tapered sedation inch by inch, like lowering a grand piano down a narrow stairwell. "Squeeze if you hear me." Nothing. "Open your eyes." Nothing. Then the faintest twitch, as if the command had to travel through a winter of snow. The respiratory therapist checked the seals, the nurse checked the lines, the chief watched the numbers with that calm that's paid for in years. "Give him time," the chief said, which at this hour was both medicine and manners. Time gave a minute. The billionaire's eyelids climbed as if the lids were heavier than they had any right to be on a man who used to outstare rooms. His gaze met the ceiling, those 1,000 little perforations people count when they can't sleep, and then tracked, slowly, toward the machine music. His lips shaped around the tube like a person trying to answer a question in a language he didn't speak yet. They brought a small whiteboard because ICU etiquette says you owe the awake a voice even if their throat isn't ready. He wrote something that looked like a currency symbol and a heartbeat, then scowled at his own handwriting as if disappointed in the market. They waited. He steadied his hand, drew letters with the same stubbornness he probably brought to boardrooms. "Who?" The nurse leaned in, the way you lean toward a cliff. "Who saved me?" The chief looked at the therapist, who looked at the nurse, who looked at the chief. There are a dozen ways to answer that question badly. The chief chose the good one. "Lots of people," they said, and a man who noticed a line where no one was looking. The billionaire's eyes tried to sharpen. He wrote again, slower, "Tell him thank you." He underlined him twice, as if underlining could force the word into a face. He tapped the board with the pen like a judge who has decided a case. They wouldn't extubate yet. That would be theater. They let the lungs keep their bicycle wheels because falling off on the last lap teaches humility to everyone. They kept oxygen the way you keep a promise. The numbers approved. Press had been prowling the curb since 3, but the hospital had a high iron fence of rules for mornings like this. Only family, only counsel, only the truth recorded in charts, not the rumors that go farther because they have longer legs. A lawyer in a tie with the color of expensive blueberries tried to ask a question shaped like a suggestion. The nurse saw through it and pointed him gently toward a chair. Malik came back in with the sun on his shoulder, from a window that hadn't remembered how to be a window all night. He had the same cart, the same economy of motion, the same habit of not wearing his importance anywhere people could trip on it. The nurse met him halfway with a tone that could pass for ordinary. He asked who, she said. We told him lots of people. And you. I only pointed, Malik said. Sometimes that's surgery, she said, and let him decide whether to believe it. He'd slept a little in the break room because that's what you do when the building lets you. He'd dreamed the small dream he'd kept since he was 21. A woman's hand reaching for the call button that wasn't there because years ago a bed had been parked where a call cord couldn't reach, and no one had noticed. And by the time anyone did, notice they were noticing other things. It was the only story he allowed himself from that year, the story that made him learn the building like a language so he wouldn't have to go to war with ghosts. At 9, turnover spilled its river of bodies through the unit. The night team gave the day team the truth. Mechanical obstruction corrected, saturation response positive. Sedation strategy conservative. Risk mitigation immediate. New wedge undercaster, literal. Crawl check had been added to the top of the checklist in a hand that would later be typed and laminated and stuck to more surfaces than anyone would admit. The Billionaire's security detail multiplied like photographs of themselves. A PR person arrived with a face trained for crisis and an email drafted in her pupils. We are grateful to the dedicated professionals. The chief intercepted it like a bouncer intercepts a drunk cousin at a wedding. Not yet, the chief said. We'll say something when saying something doesn't steal concentration. The billionaire's daughter came in, an adult who had never looked more like a child. She had her father's jaw and her mother's refusal to cry where anyone could make a career out of it. She held his hand around tape and tubing and said the kind of nothing that means everything. When she lifted her head, she asked the question her father had already asked. Who? The nurse gave the same answer, plus the part that mattered. A janitor, Malik. He saw what others didn't. The daughter looked down the hall at the man in the navy jacket with the cart and the posture of a person who knows hallways better than rooms. She walked over because some stories have to be told standing up. Thank you, she said. He shook his head because shaking his head was easier than letting his face say anything in public. It's what nights are for, he said. Hearing things that don't raise their voice. She smiled like a person filing a line away for the rest of her life. Hospitals are greedy for routine, even on days when donors nearly die. The unit returned to its hunger for tasks. But the day had another set piece hidden in its pocket. Around noon, while radiology did their elegant ballet behind lead glass and the ICU relaxed into a small, earned boredom, facilities rolled a cart with bed guards, a simple plastic shield that clips over casters to keep the underworld under control. Someone had fast-tracked an order at sunrise. Someone else had called in a favor. Within hours, the unit wore little halos at floor level. The billionaire's numbers kept their end of the bargain. With the vent doing less, his chest remembered to lift on its own. A resident ran a careful exam that would have bored a camera crew but thrilled anyone who cares about brains. Reflexes there, pupils, cooperative. Command following, better than the night's prediction. Prognosis crept from maybe to if, from if to likely, one cautious rung at a time. By late afternoon, they tried a trial. Minutes of breathing with less leash. He did not sprint. He didn't need to. The therapist ran the clock with a poker face. The nurse narrated the room under her breath like a play-by-play for one. The billionaire held the line like a man who had once held other kinds of lines and had decided to hold this one too. Back on, the therapist said after the trial. Not as retreat, but as strategy. We'll give him another in a bit. The day's calm pulled media like gravity. They didn't get inside, but they turned the curb into a water cooler the size of a street. Sources say, a thin man with a windblown tie told a camera, a procedural error may have contributed. The hospital did not nod along. Inside, people kept doing the work that makes rumors irrelevant. At evening, the billionaire gestured for the board again. He wrote in block letters, the way a man writes when he needs his words to stick. No NDA. The lawyer with the blueberry tie blinked. Sir, that's not... The billionaire tapped the board again without looking at him. No NDA tell story name him. The chief said, we'll wait until you're strong enough to say it in your voice. He nodded because control had always been his past, and the only thing about the future he was interested in was owning it. Malik finished his shift with the kind of quiet that makes supervisors ask if you're okay even when you absolutely are. In the locker room, he stared at a metal door pocked with the stories of other men's knuckles and thought about how quickly a line can change a life. His phone buzzed with 3 texts that had somehow already found him in a city large enough to lose a person. One from a cousin who'd seen something on TV, one from a friend who worked in laundry. Bro, is that you? And one from a number he didn't recognize that began, on behalf of Mr. He put the phone face down because finishing a shift had its own holiness. Night again. The ICU's blues returned. The unit, remodeled by one small correction and 10 small decisions after it, took its midnight breath. The billionaire slept the kind of sleep you can hear from monitors more than from bodies. The wedge under the caster looked like a small, stubborn monument. At 2 a.m., the hospital did what hospitals always do. It tested whether the day's lesson had sunk in. A transfer came in. Nothing cinematic. A pneumonia that had outgrown its first bed. The receiving bay to the billionaire's left filled with the choreography Malik knew in his bones. In the shuffle, a bed tried its little dance toward the head wall. A new nurse, cheeks flushed with the weight of both responsibility and coffee, reached for a pump and stopped herself mid-reach. Malik, pause, she said, half joking, half not. She went to her knees, put a hand under the rail, and ran a crawl check like a pro engineer inspecting a bridge. Everything was clean. She rose with a grin that looked like a woman deciding to belong. The phrase traveled faster than any memo would have. In an hour, 3 other people said it. By dawn, someone had written it on the whiteboard by the desk. Malik, pause. Crawl check before you click. The chief saw it, didn't erase it, and that's how cultures change. Morning arrived again with cameras. This time, the hospital let the story inside on its own terms. They didn't bring the billionaire to a dais. They brought a microphone to the ICU anteroom, where walls can hear promises. The chief spoke first, saying the names of teams without turning team into an emptier word than it already is. Then, with a measured breath, they said a name that rooms tend to fold around the edges of. Malik Turner, the chief said, nodding toward the corridor where a man in a navy jacket was trying to be mistaken for a wall. Environmental Services. He listened when a machine wasn't using its whole sentence. He pointed. We fixed. The patient improved. The PR person backstage visibly aged 3 years at the words Environmental Services being placed in front of cameras, and then, because growth is sometimes involuntary, she smiled. They asked Malik to step forward. He did in the way a person steps onto a dock that wobbles. Flashes went off. Someone shouted a question about how it feels to save a billionaire. He said, we don't save money, we save air. The line landed and stood up on its own. Through the glass, the billionaire lifted a hand and managed a small wave. He was still wearing more tubing than the average parade float, but his eyebrows could do what mouths can't. Thank you, stay there, don't make it weird. The billionaire wrote a new thing for the whiteboard, using careful letters that tried to be straight and failed and tried again. Fund safety. Malik scholarships beds get guards. He turned the board so the camera could catch it, then rolled his eyes like a man who has dealt with cameras long enough to be unafraid of looking human. The lawyer with the blueberry tie looked at the ceiling and reconsidered his profession. Within a week, a foundation with a name that used to fund wings no one visits started wiring money to a program the hospital called Night Detail. Tuition for certification. If you work the hours when everyone else sleeps. Hazard pay for the parts of the building that never shut up. A replacement cycle for the cheap parts that try to do expensive work and fail at the worst time. A vendor shipped pallet after pallet of caster guards. A manufacturer emailed CAD files for a redesign because sometimes shame is an effective engineer. The billionaire asked to meet Malik without cameras. No entourage, no speech. Just a man in a hospital gown, thinner around the shoulders than a magazine would ever allow, and another man still in his jacket because he didn't know what he was supposed to wear to talk to someone whose signature could alter a skyline. The billionaire tried to joke about market corrections. Malik tried to joke about floors that think they're ice rinks. Both jokes were fine. Then the billionaire did a thing that money makes harder and sickness makes easier. He apologized. I've built companies that outsourced you, he said. Cut your hours. Called your job non-essential whenever the spreadsheet got hungry. And last night the person my spreadsheets erase is the one who kept me here. Malik shrugged, not to dismiss the words, but to let them land without cracking the table. Lots of people kept you here, he said. I just heard something. My mother died in this building when I was young, not in this unit. Somewhere with fewer windows and more echoes. A cord wasn't where it should have been. Nobody's fault, everybody's night. I took this job years later because buildings remember, and I didn't want to be outside of the remembering. The billionaire closed his eyes because sometimes listening is heavier than lifting. When he opened them, he wrote one more thing on the board between them. Will you let me pay for whatever you want to build? Malik took the marker, the first time that day he'd taken anything that wasn't his. He wrote, build a rule that outlives us. The billionaire tapped the word rule like a gavel. Done, he said, the tube in his throat making the word a dry wind. Weeks passed the way good weeks do when an ICU picks a man up and puts him down on the other side of a bad season. The extubation happened without theater, early in a morning that didn't know it was about to be on 1,000 phones. The first words the billionaire said were not a brand statement. They were, thank you, Malik. The second words were, keep the pause. Reporters did their reporting. Pundits tried to turn a story about air and humility into a referendum on everything else. The hospital quietly printed a laminated card that said, anyone can call a safety pause, and clipped it to lanyards until it became something people stopped seeing because it's everywhere. Which is exactly how you want safety to live. Malik kept his route. It got longer only in the sense that people waved now, and he had to wave back without crashing the cart. He signed the papers that made the scholarship real. Night Detail funded a cohort of people who used to leave their brilliance in the break room because they didn't think it belonged anywhere else. A young housekeeper became a sterile processing tech. A security guard started nursing school. Someone in laundry wrote a poem that the chaplain read at a service none of the daytime executives attended because they were in a meeting about gratitude strategy. On the day the billionaire walked out under his own power, the cameras went wild at the curb. He paused at the threshold and, for a second, seemed smaller than the glass behind him. "Here's the story," he said, and for once meant only the story. "I almost died. The people you expect to be brilliant were brilliant. The person you don't see was, too. We didn't need a miracle. We needed a building to be treated like an instrument and a man to listen. Build places where anyone can say stop." That's the headline. He found Malik at the edge of the crowd because some edges are where the center hides. They shook hands like men who have traded the worst versions of themselves for better ones in a currency not minted anywhere. No plaque. No ribbon. Just two people who had learned that sometimes the detail that changes everything is not only a tube under a wheel, it's a culture under a weight, deciding not to be flattened anymore. That night, the hospital sang its same long song. The elevator's click, the ice machine's lies, the pump's polite sighs. Malik made his rounds with the flashlight that had learned to be shy and the ears that had learned to be brave. A new nurse doing her first solo shift paused by a bed and crouched unprompted to run a hand under the rail. "Malik, pause," she said to no one, smiling. He moved on, a man who had not become a hero so much as he had been allowed to keep being useful in a world finally willing to hear the small sounds that keep us here.